Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Climbing Sycamores podcast, where we look at today's topics to get a better view of Christianity. I'm Annie Beege, and I'm joined by my friends Ben Sadler and Matt Harbach. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Climbing Sycamores podcast.
And then there was two.
Matt is out.
There's been a plague going around, and it's got to be all over because I have a pastor friend out in Washington who had the stomach bug. Then I had a friend up in northern Wisconsin who's got the stomach bug. It is everywhere.
And COVID's back, it seems, at least.
Yeah, we thought we said goodbye to you, but
still around.
Big wave. So we're going to try to make this interesting, although can you be a little more sarcastic and a little drier, or is there any way to imitate Matt in this? Can we bring up a dry comment every once in a while?
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay. So, yeah, Annie and I have been seeing each other a lot lately with our kids doing wrestling and basketball. And
Ben, you've been coaching basketball,
goodness.
which we're grateful for.
Yeah, the boys played really hard. I remember telling Bill when I moved here, like, oh, man, the people in this area are so sports centered. I can't believe they can't do anything. And now I'm one of those people.
As opposed to what?
Different places that I lived, it just didn't feel like, maybe it was an age category thing, but I just didn't feel like there was as many activities going on. And we in the greater Milwaukee area love our kids' sports, and it is just every night there's something, and it's good. I mean, I think it's good that we're busy, but man, it is a tight calendar.
It's a bit much. Yes.
It's a bit much.
It's a bit much. I was saying to somebody earlier today, like some days my day is scheduled almost by the minute.
Yeah.
Down to, I've got maybe a 15-minute leeway where I have to be somewhere, do something. And yeah, it's wild.
And there's some times where I'm like, does this matter? Why are we doing all this? And this is crazy. And then there's other times like, oh, the pressure, like, oh, I didn't sign him up for all these camps and I'm not getting the trainer and he's going to, our kids are going to fall behind. And yeah.
Well, and why, and we've talked about kids sports on the podcast before. The more I was thinking about it recently with the kids involved in all these sports and whatever, and multiple sports in one season. And why do we do this? And honestly, I think I just want my kids to play in high school.
Sure.
And it's really competitive.
Yeah, it is.
And so, I'm not expecting my kids to get scholarships or even play in college necessarily, but I do want them to play in high school.
Yeah.
But it's just so stinking competitive.
It's very. You got me, and I've been in Emily's, my wife's family, wrestling, and Jonah did it before, but now he's doing it now. And there's so many things, and I don't know anything about wrestling. I still understand how the points work. I understand a pin, I understand takedown and escape, I think, right? But as far as like forming a human being, I think it is amazing. I'm sure I've heard people say the same thing about jiu-jitsu or any kind of martial arts, but like the ability to learn mental control, be in a stressful situation, learn how to defend yourself, learn how to overcome adversity, learn how to fail, learn how to get beaten, and yet still not learn how to lose, but still be okay. And that's some of the coaches keep saying, win like you lose, get up, shake the guy's hand, and keep moving forward. So, and then just the sheer exhaustion of the sport, it's amazing.
Physical pain, there's pain involved,
So
yeah, it's really a great sport.
So, anyways,
you have a subject that you've been doing. Was it a Victory U?
Yeah,
course?
So I did a 3-week Victory U course, and I think we might have mentioned briefly on the podcast, but there's something I just keep coming back to. I don't know if it's my personality or what, but it's about almost a decade ago, maybe not that much. Yeah, maybe about a decade ago, I was introduced to this whole area of how many people have suffered trauma, especially abuse, because I went to a conference called Chaplains for Children. It was put on by a guy named Victor Veith, and Victor Veith is kind of like he's a guy in our church body, but he's also kind of internationally recognized as one of the top prosecutors of child abuse. And then he also does and he does talks and runs a whole nonprofit organization. And also works with our church body in something called Freedom for the Captives. And he got me thinking about this. And I don't have any real trauma in my past or any abuse or anything like that. But when I realized the statistics, it kind of blew my mind, and it kind of is almost, I think, the thing behind everything else. So have you heard of, and I don't know if I've talked about this, the ACE study before?
Adverse childhood experience?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But go ahead and go ahead
Yeah.
and tell.
So he talked about it. It's on the CDC website. You can find more information on there. But originally started as a weight loss study. And so this doctor was doing a weight loss study, and he noticed that the people who gained or lost the most weight in this weight loss study also gained it back the quickest. And so he started asking questions. And what he found out was all those people were sexually abused as children. And they said, this is just my coping mechanism, or this is what I feel keeps me safe.
The food, you mean?
Yeah, the food. Yeah,
okay.
Gaining weight keeps me safe. It keeps me from, being noticed and those kinds of things. And then he started asking more questions, and he started to do a much larger study to see, like, wow, I didn't see a correlation between weight gain or health and abuse. And then he found all these correlations that you would never think there are. And he developed this study called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, where if you have an adverse childhood experience, and you categorize them into different things, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, all those kinds of things. If you've seen something, if you witnessed, a shooting or witnessed a traumatic event, you would get an ACE score. And the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to have a series of symptoms. And they include things that I thought would have no connection whatsoever, like asthma,
Really?
cancer, bipolar disorder, sexual promiscuity, drug use, lung cancer. So many of these things are like, how is that connected? And I think the more I've researched it, one of the reasons is if you're, if you get chased by a bear, your body goes into fight or flight, and that's normal. And then the bear goes away, and you leave the woods, and you die. You're fine. All that hyperarousal goes away. But if you're a little kid and that bear shows up in your bedroom every night, you never come down off that mountain.
And you're anticipating it probably. And
all that
stressing about
stuff.
all day. Yeah, it's not surprise. It's expected and anticipate. Yeah.
And so your body is fighting that. And because your body is still fighting those memories and fighting the post-traumatic stress, it can't fight the normal things that it's fighting off cancers and fighting off mental disorders and fighting off all these things. It's all being directed towards this one thing. And then the other reasons would be, coping with that it's easy to cope with it with drugs and alcohol, at least in the moment, to kind of forget about it. So that what I try to help people see is like, this all makes sense when you see this. And it changed my total view of ministry. I think in the past, I would see somebody being sexually promiscuous or getting involved in drugs and alcohol or maybe having other health issues.
And you're like, don't do that. It's so simple. Don't do that. Just don't do that. It's not good for you. Or, and now you see it's much
You
deeper.
start asking different questions.
Yeah, wild. Okay.
And not that every situation goes back to that, but to let people know, especially when you start to realize the statistics. Now, this could be all corollary, not necessarily causal, but I think there is some causal issues when it comes to this. But according to the ACE study, in the best of neighborhoods, 1 out of 4 women have been sexually abused, and 1 out of 6 men.
And that's in affluent
It's in the best of neighborhoods.
Really?
Yeah. So if you're in a neighborhood that's got a lot of distress and
poverty,
chaos and
things,
poverty and things like that, you're going to have even higher numbers. And so it's a big deal, and it's something that causes a lot of shame. And so those numbers could be higher for men. I said in the class that in my experience, I would think it would be 1 out of 10 women, as people kind of disclose to me when I start talking about this, and 1 out of 50 men, and it's no surprise why there's really high, alcohol abuse among men and other kinds of things because they just don't feel comfortable talking about that.
A lot of Prozac in the suburbs.
Yeah, that a lot of stuff like that. So what I want to talk about today is, what is trauma? The reality that some people maybe diagnose themselves, self-diagnose as post-traumatic stress and maybe aren't, and yet you can use it like as a victim category. And then there's others who really are suffering and they don't know what to do about it, and they're not coming forward. And then maybe just some of the things I learned through the class. So yeah, how's that sound? Is there some things that
good.
Okay.
Well, I think one question I probably have is, because people are different, I'm sure that their responses to the same type of trauma. So I think, to define what is trauma and what are the varying levels of trauma and what's traumatic to one person might not be traumatic or seemingly as traumatic. And are there cases too where people kind of tuck it so far back that they don't even acknowledge that it's a thing, and maybe they seem to be fine, but it's like just back there, somewhere. You just get on, you know what I mean? Like some people are really vocal about it, and they, and some people don't.
Right.
So I'll just go ahead. I'll stop.
Well,
you
I think
questions.
you're right. So you brought up, it's different for different people, right? What was your level of autonomy? Were you able to? The worst is like if you're in like a child, you have no ability to leave, you have no ability to talk, you've been shut down, you've been shamed, you've been quieted, you've been silenced, and that's the worst. It's kind of like the most evil and the most deadly of trauma, because that's where you really. But those who feel like a sense of maybe agency or ability, or they don't seem to have that same level. I know I've heard of soldiers talk about. It seems like sometimes, if you had a sense of advocacy or authority and autonomy in that moment in battle, you're going to respond to what happened differently than somebody else.
Okay.
So that's a big thing. As far as now, I'm not a psychologist. I've just done a ton of reading on this, and I'm not a therapist. But then I also counsel biblical counseling quite a few people over the years, and just the studying I've been doing. So I think I have some thoughts on that. And I really used Tim Borman's book, Deep as the Sea. Tim Borman's a pastor out in New York. He's a Lutheran pastor. And he doesn't, everywhere I've seen him talk, and even in this book, he doesn't talk about it. And so he always says, if you want to know my story, look up my name. It's the first thing on there. It made it big stories. Long story short, he was in a plane crash. And for whatever reason, he doesn't seem to want to go into all, which is fine. That's his story, and he can do whatever he wants with it. But his book is super helpful. He interviewed a bunch of people. He really kind of made it his mission to understand how you can help, what happens biblically. And so I thought he had some just really helpful things. First of all, just like defining what trauma is.
Yeah, that's big, I think.
And so he says trauma, it's just a Greek word that means a wound. And so that's kind of a big thing. And the problem with trauma is it's a lot of times a wound you can't see. If I get cut or I get knocked in the head or something, you can see the bruise, you can see the wound. These traumatic memories and the traumatic emotional damage and the brain damage and physical damage that it does internally, you can't see. And so it's usually defined by 3 characteristics, he says. A person, they have intrusion, which means these kind of intrusive thoughts where you can't stop forgetting, or you can't, they just have a way of like the present, the past event comes charging into the present, and you have no ability to stop it. At least you feel like you have no ability to stop it. So it's an intrusion. So I was listening to a podcast this morning by a psychologist, and he said it's kind of a myth, comes from Freud, that everybody's got this trauma that they can't remember, and we have a repressed memory. No, a sign of post-traumatic stress is that you can't forget. So it is there.
Okay.
It is inhibiting your life. It's not something you necessarily need to go searching for. You don't need to go searching for this stress that you have. It's intruding into your life. So you have intrusion. The second thing is constriction, like falling into despair, this lack of hope. Like my past is defining me. This event is always going to be in the forefront of my mind. I can't seem to get rid of it. It's kind of a learned helplessness, a learned sense of hopelessness. You might, often I think the high rate of suicide in the military, I've heard statistics that there are more people who commit suicide in the military than have died in battle. And then a lot of that is just this hopelessness. So that's the third thing. And then hyperarousal. It's like your fight or flight is always at the boiling point. It's always right there, ready to either fight, flight, or freeze. And really easily kind of triggered into that moment. So that kind of goes back to all those health issues because you're always at this level. I remember speaking to a counselor. I was working with a man who just came back from fighting in Iraq and he had a really challenging deployment, lost his commanding officer right when they got there. And so he was ticked. And so they just went in through some really hard things, lived out of that kind of anger. And then he came back and he just was really struggling. And so I asked his counselor, like, what is he going through? And he said, we rev up our engines and we rev them up when we need to, and then they go back down. But this guy is always going to be on high alert because that's what he experienced. His body never learned how to calm down after war. So that's what it is. Now,
man, those three things like combined, like one alone is bad, but to have all three of those things at once, yikes.
Right, and that's why you have that sense of helplessness. Now the problem is that's a real thing that people are really dealing with. But when you talk to people, they don't call themselves victims of this. They don't want it anymore. I think one thing that we're dealing with in our culture is almost using that as a victim category. And whether you have it or not, I don't think anyone wants to just calling yourself a victim and not a survivor is not the way out. We want to learn how to cope with life and not just cope, but thrive, be a victor in Christ, to work through it. And so that's something that was really, really, really powerful. So maybe I could go on to talk about John Sable and his story. And then there's a couple other things I was thinking would be interesting, like how do you actually heal? So John came and gave an interview. John Sable is a member of our church. He works at Wisconsin Lutheran High School. And 2 years ago on Valentine's Day, he was making steak out, grilling steak. His daughter was there, brought a new boyfriend over, and they were having a great time. And that's all he remembers. He says, I guess I was taste testing a piece, and he doesn't remember this, but it got lodged deep in his throat, like way down. They tried the Heimlich maneuver, jumped right in. They couldn't get it out. He passed out, flatlined, and they were doing chest compressions. And because they were doing chest compressions, the blood kept pumping to his organs and to his brain, and so they kept him alive, got him out. And he said that his level of death, as far as he went, only 10% make it to the hospital and 1% survive.
Wild.
Yeah. Now, what's crazy is he didn't remember any of those events, but he had PTSD.
Okay, how so?
So then he started having these nightmares where he had all these things where he said he woke up, and if you want to see the full interview, you can go to our Victory YouTube Live page, and it'll be on there. But he talked about like waking up in the middle of the night and like a pool of water in his bed. That's how he would have these sweats that he would, and he was unable to function to work. Everyone wanted to hear you overcame this. Isn't this great? You're alive. But he was dealing with all of this stuff. And according to the book, The Body Keeps the Score, if you don't deal with this, your body still thinks there is a problem that's not resolved. And it's still emotionally trying to get you to resolve that problem, or it still feels like it's in danger. So it doesn't believe that the past is in the past.
So the mind-body kind of connection there to, okay.
So it's still responding like it's trying to fight off death. And so, yeah, he get really depressed, like really, really depressed. And then a lot of it was the horrific nightmares. He could not stop having like really intense nightmares of dying or someone he loves die or trying to help somebody. And extremely vivid, couldn't do his job, all those things. So he had hyperarousal, constriction, intrusion, all the memories, even though he didn't remember it, his body keeps the score. His body remembered it.
Okay.
Then he ended up seeing a counselor, and he's been working with a Christian counselor, and she really helped. But even after that, it was still struggling. One of the big things for him was getting involved with a men's Bible study, and they're just really close men who just loved him and cared for him and gave him encouragement, and just, which I think is really important, that friendships are more important than we think. I think going to a therapist is huge because they can help put things together.
And they're unbiased too.
And they're unbiased.
You know,
yeah. But that's just part of a recovery plan. Is a good therapist. It's also those other things. So his story is pretty remarkable. And what I also heard was, I didn't come to your class because I had this. I lost this person, but I didn't
the Victory U class. People said to you, I didn't come.
I didn't come because I don't think I had trauma. I thought what you meant with trauma was that you were abused or something like that. But trauma can be any of these things that are causing that constriction or intrusion or hyperarousal in your day-to-day life that you continue to struggle, or some of these other health issues. Now, again, you don't need to go searching for a trauma if you don't have one, but many people do have one, and the symptoms of not being able to function in day-to-day life let you know that you need to do something about it. And so the three things that you can do, Diane Laneberg talks about this in her book, Suffering the Heart of God. The three things are talking, tears, and time. And some people think, well, I'll just take a bunch of time. That was 20 years ago. That when I had that accident, or that thing happened to me, or I was abused, or I was raped, or whatever. But the way I describe it is, if you break an arm and your arm is sticking sideways, it doesn't matter how much time you give it, it needs to be reset. So time alone doesn't heal. And so we really kind of give a disservice when, somebody can't function day-to-day life, and we say, oh, just get over it. That was 20 years ago. Well, if they haven't found a way to deal with it, it's still going, just like with that broken arm, your body is going to keep reminding you that your arm is broken until you fix it. Your body's going to keep reminding you of this trauma until you set it straight, until you figure out how to do that. And tears is a big thing, talking about what was lost and grieving over that, because what we don't often do is we don't accept it. Sometimes we try to believe that this actually didn't happen, or I didn't really lose that thing, or that. And so you're living in the past as a way of not accepting that you lost something, whatever it was. You lost a moment of time, a relationship, a sense of innocence, something about who you were, you lost, and you have to grieve that. Now, what's incredible is the Psalms help you do that. They let the first half of the Psalms are all about yelling at God, like, where were you, God? What are you doing? My God, why are you forsaking me? Jesus used Psalm 22, and he's from the cross. And then as you get to the last part of the Psalms, they're all, I praise you, God. Thank you, God. And that's kind of the life of somebody who's been a survivor. Is at first you have this grieving, this anger, and this sadness, and you have to go through that. But if you walk through that long enough, you'll eventually get to praise. And then talking, I didn't realize how important this was, not just talking to dig up the whole thing and replay it. And sometimes there's been studies that say some counselors go too far with that. Like they just always want to keep you stuck there. But you do need to talk about it, because when you have a really significant traumatic event, you do kind of black out. And your body does that for a good reason. Again, with the broken arm, like you don't feel the arm in that moment. Your body knows that something went wrong. It shuts things down so you can't experience. And what a blessing that God gave us that, so that, because the evil that happens to some people is so horrific, but your body doesn't let you experience it. It doesn't let you feel it. It doesn't let you feel it in the moment. And that's such a blessing. But because of that, it's like a puzzle that gets dumped out on a table. It's all scattered ideas. And your brain is a meaning-creating machine. It wants to make sense of things. It wants to put things into a story with a beginning, middle, and end. But because of how trauma kind of explodes your past, you can't make sense. So talking helps you kind of say, all right, this is when it happened. This is what actually happened. This is why it was so hard. But this is where I am today. And so when you can talk, you can kind of put things in a logical order. So as you can see, I could talk about this for hours. So I don't know, what sparks questions you, or what do you think about that?
No, I think, do you have statistics there? Do you have numbers there that you want, or just the...
Well, I think the biggest number is that
just the 1 in 4.
Yeah, the 1 in 4 and 1 in 6. But also, according to Timothy Borman, I think he said 60% of all men have had a traumatic experience. So even though it's not all sexual abuse, it's some kind of trauma. And what I'd also like about what he says in the book is calling it a disorder is probably not necessarily helpful, because this is just what happens to some people.
It's life.
Yeah.
Like, and that's why I really like how you related it to ministry, and how that's changed your outlook. Excuse me. And I think that if we start looking at people who are engaged in some of these reckless behaviors, and how did they end up there? Like nobody like sets out and says like, oh, I would like to be addicted to drugs, and like there's usually a reason that kind of happens. And I think if we look beyond that, you see that a lot of people are hurting and struggling. And that's, I think I knew that makes sense to me, but I never actually like put it together. Yeah. So like, that's pretty wild.
The other thing that I've learned is sometimes we give grace to the perpetrator, and very often perpetrator being a wide category, abusive and controlling, or using their power to hurt somebody, whatever that is, can be some of the smartest people, some of the seemingly most godly people in the church or in the community, who, the Sandusky situation, right? He was one of the coaches at Penn State and had all these victims, and upstanding man in society, volunteered, had all this great resume, didn't have a criminal record, and yet he had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of victims. So
how do you mean we give people grace?
So
you mean him, or
you would look at somebody maybe in the congregation. One person is promiscuous and addicted to drugs, and we say that person needs the law. They need to know how messed up they are, and they need to repent of their sins and turn to Jesus. But look at what's his face over there, who's volunteering. Yeah, sometimes he says some weird things, but I know he can be a little bit heavy-handed at home, but he's always here volunteering, and he's always doing all these right things, and his wife doesn't always listen to him, and so sometimes he yells,
right.
And you make excuses for somebody, you don't pick up on it. And Jesus has a way to help us to see the difference. And it's still very hard, but he said, first of all, be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves.
That's your like go-to.
I love that.
We're going to put that on your gravestone.
I know. I love it.
It's good.
Because I know of too many pastors that I've talked to and said, I want you to know this person that's moved to your congregation, they left here because they don't want us to deal with them.
Yes.
And they don't believe me.
Right.
Oh, whatever. So that really upsets me. Or I've just seen it over and over again. And the statistics are that so often the church sides with the perpetrator, minimizes what the perpetrator did, and blames the victim. It happens over and over again.
And
hundreds of cases.
I think it's really tricky. I never want to be accused of victim blaming. But at the end of the day, people are human. And so there probably are cases, right, where, the facts get skewed and you've got somebody who's portraying themselves as a victim. And the facts might not completely be, and so what do you do in that scenario, where maybe it's not appropriate to delve into, you don't want to go to the other party and be like, well, so-and-so said, and then you want to fact check.
Right.
So what do how do you, maybe that's a wise as serpents or innocent as doves.
I think, so if there is an outcry and you hear something, don't try to deal with it internally. I think if it is a sexual abuse or physical abuse, to report, and it's anonymous, and nobody else needs to know about it. But then the authorities will very often, churches get in issues, and secular organizations don't seem to struggle with this as much as the church does. The church thinks that they can deal with it internally. We'll handle it.
Cover it
and
up.
We talk. There was, so often it was the Catholic Church that was in the news, but now there was a huge, the Baptist Church, Southern Baptist Convention had, was it 400 cases or something like that were covered up?
Yeah.
The other thing that I think you can really tell is Jesus says you will know somebody by their fruit. So anyone can say anything. And that's the thing. Do your actions match up with your words? And that's a big sign for me. When somebody is telling me all their accolades, they've come into my office with their Bible, they're telling me all these stories, and then what they're actually doing and the text that they're sending to their wife or the actual thing that they're doing, their actions tell a different message, and it's very intentional to say one thing. So I think that's a really big thing. As far as another outcry, especially in these cases, like the false accusations, I think there's far less than we think.
Okay.
And because there's so much shame. For a person to actually get up the courage in these real cases, so often it's 20 years later, and they're a guy and don't want to say that, because they feel so like, why didn't I do anything about it? Why didn't I get out of that? Guys and gals, I could have, and they blame themselves. It's very, very common to blame themselves. And so I think we need to keep our ears open when somebody finally gets the courage to say, I need to tell you something. I've also, one of the ways to kind of be alert to perpetrators is kind of the minimization. There was a great paper written by this Victor Veith guy, and based on, I forget the pastor's name. He was a Lutheran pastor who was asked to go over and interview the Nazi soldiers. And they were all Lutherans because they're German or what. And so he worked with counselors and therapists and himself, and he was not quick. They were all kind of on death row because of what they had done, but he wouldn't commune all of them. He was very slow to listen to what they had to say before he would give them absolution and forgiveness and communion, because they were so good at twisting the truth and saying one thing and another. I remember right away after I met with Victor Veith and met him for the first time, there was a couple that came into my office and said, this guy said, "Oh, Pastor, I just love the way you preach. I've been drawn to this church, and that sounds great." And I was like, "Oh, that's nice," and oh, great. And just there was a lot of praising, which okay, sure, stroke my ego and all that stuff. But then he's like, oh, we want to get married in this church. Okay, that sounds great. And then we met a couple times, and he's like, oh, this is like a week before the wedding. Oh, by the way, Pastor, I got this thing that you might see in the news, but I pleaded guilty, but I'm not really guilty. I just want to set a plea bargain so that I wouldn't, so we get through this. And I think if it would have been years earlier and I didn't know Victor Veith, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's really hard that you went through that and not ask more questions. And I think that's the thing I've learned is to ask more questions. Like, so what Victor Veith told me is like, okay, ask for a disclosure statement that you can see the record. Ask to see what really happened. Talk to like, oh, if you want to get married, I need to know more information about this. And so just keep asking questions. Long story short, he did sexually abuse somebody in the family, and he was going to go to trial, and we weren't going to do the wedding. And I told this woman, what are you doing getting married to this guy?
Did she? I mean, she knew?
So they never... Yeah, I mean, he had a way of kind of massaging it all and covering up. But so I think that's what I mean about being wise that I've learned is just ask more questions, see if words are matching up with actions. And then the same thing when you hear somebody make an outcry, somebody might, when it comes to traumatic stuff, they might say something that's a little off and they don't know how to disclose, but they're trying to test out if you're safe. And so they'll say, I don't know. Yeah, something like that happened to me, or, they would say something that you're like, oh, you just got to trust your gut. Like, is there more going on here? And you're trying to see if I'm safe. That's a big thing. And so I think just being aware of that dynamic, but also, just being aware of how you can be really foolish or tricked by the person you think is the last person to be the problem, and the person you thought was the problem is very often the opposite.
Right.
So,
oh, that's interesting. And I feel like I can think of that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, and we've had different cases that I think you're aware of here at church of people who've been like that I think all these past experiences have helped me clarify that's a sheep, that's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And we have to be very clear on that. And what Pastor Borman says is like, to the survivor or the victim, when you preach justice from the pulpit on those kinds of people who would use God's word to control others, that's good news to them. That's good news to the survivor that because very often God's word is twisted to heap more guilt. But
that is offensive to me as a Christian.
Yeah.
People who do that, it's like, man.
I mean, there's all these stories of, pray before abuse happens and see God didn't answer our prayer. So, this God must be okay with this and all that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing that I want people to know is there's incredible hope. Once you do take the courageous step of talking to a counselor, a pastor, trusted friends, not everybody, but trusted people, once you do go through the grieving process, once you do take the time to do this, and then once you kind of set your sights on making something meaningful of what happened to you, there's just incredible power in that, and you can be an incredible force for good, and your best days are yet to come, and they're very often that place of your pain can be the biggest place of purpose for you in your life, and it doesn't need to be hopeless. It doesn't need to be your only story. So I think that's something that I've just learned, and I think I'm passionate about, like, seeing people remarry who were in a really and being able to differentiate like what a healthy person is and what an unhealthy person is, and seeing people get freedom and then help others. I mean, even John Sabol, so he did this talk on Wednesday night, and I know there's already people that are asking him like, all right, I've never told anybody, but this is what happened to me and this is what's going on. If you survive that, that's exactly what I've experienced. And so I already see John now not only coming out of a helpless situation he felt like and really hard situation to now serving lots of people. He's starting to write on what he's gone through, so it can be really powerful.
Purpose, having a purpose, and I think we often see a lot of trauma survivors, turn their pain and trauma into, a foundation
Oh yeah.
to
Incredible.
raise money for X that happened to them, or something to, going public speaking about their experience so that they can raise awareness about whatever it is, So I think we see that happen like a lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the hope. So maybe this podcast could be just encouragement to those who are out there who are just beating themselves up. That's pretty easy to do, stuck, trying to, sometimes people blame themselves as a way of kind of making sense of it because it's so horrible that they can't believe that there's such evil in the world. But I would just encourage, go talk to somebody. I'm happy to help any way I can. Turn this, this can be turned around. One thing Tim Borman says is like, I believe God can heal anybody, which is a powerful message. And along with all the other help that you can get. And yeah, so it's a big deal. And so I'm thankful we did the class. I know lots of people said, how are you going to, that's 3 weeks. We need 3 months, but we can't only talk about this, but I want people to know this is a safe place to talk about it. We do almost have like a trauma-informed kind of perspective on lots of things in our ministry. You're not going to be shamed. You're going to be heard. And also, if you think, lots of times perpetrators pick churches because we're naive, and it's just let people know, like,
that ain't us.
Not in us.
Nope.
Yeah. Move on, buddy.
Yep.
Move on. And that's probably the best thing. That's what the best thing that we can do for, some of these people, and we've seen this, they're going to hurt somebody. So all you can do is put up a strong front. And so if you can be an organization, a church, a business, a nonprofit, whatever it is, that has a strong front, has a strong child protection policy, has a strong safety team, you're alert to those issues, you talk about it, you're not naive, they move on because it's too
hard.
Much. It's too hard. So you want to be that kind of organization that makes it hard for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
So that's a deep topic. That's pretty heavy.
No, it's good.
Yeah.
Really good.
So, yeah, I just want to keep praying for God's people. And I think, wow, there's going to be some cool healing, I think, in the future because of some of the stuff that's being done.
That's good. Yeah, we hope so.
We good?
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
If you'd like to get a hold of us here at the Climbing Sycamores podcast, feel free to email bsadler@victoryofthelamb.com. bsadler@victoryofthelamb.com. If you like today's intro music, it's been brought to you by Andrew Lynch's song, My Name, Hello.